Well, good evening, folks. We'll just wait a few minutes, but you're in the right place if you want to hear about eBirds, and we'll start in just a couple minutes. I'll repeat that as people enter the room, but welcome. And as people wander in, just let you know we'll get started in a couple minutes.
That's a good picture of me, Kent. I wish I still looked that good.
And while we wait for people to enter the room, anybody can correctly guess the number of birds in the right-hand circle wins the thank you. We'll start in just a minute or two. And if you're just entering the room, your sound is working. We're just waiting for people to wander in and we'll get going soon. Give it about one more minute. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third and final webinar in our series, Birding the Oregon Coast. This particular series is Your Data is for the Birds. Tonight's webinar is Giving Back to Birds by Contributing Observations to eBird. My name is Kent Doty. I am the Coastal Conservation Coordinator for Seven Capes Bird Alliance. I want to also thank our partner organizations for this webinar series, Oregon Birding Association, Mid-Willamette Bird Alliance, Oregon State University Bird Nerds, and Cascade Biosphere. You do amazing work, and we certainly all appreciate it. I want to also give a shout out to Nissa Parker, our digital media coordinator at Seven Capes, who has been instrumental in making this series possible. And she's the brains and the genius behind Seven Capes webpage looking so good. This is a webinar format, so only the panelists are visible and the audience is muted for the courtesy of the speaker. Following introductions, our speaker will talk and give a presentation. And just to let you know, there'll be plenty of time for question and answer. Doug has said that's the part of the presentation he most enjoys because it's interactive with the audience. As the talk goes along, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A chat tab that should be at the bottom or top of your screen, and then we'll read those back after the presentation. Tonight's program should finish up at 7:30, and just to let you know, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Seven Capes YouTube page. So a little bit about us. Seven Capes Bird Alliance, formerly the Audubon Society of Lincoln City, has been serving Lincoln and Tillamook County since 2006. Our core programs are education, community science, and conservation action. We provide monthly birding outings suitable for all ages and all knowledge levels. We prov- Our conservation focus areas include forest practices, water quality, rocky habitats, marine reserves, and threats to birds and wildlife, all viewed through the lens of climate change. Learn more about us at sevencapes.org. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land we are living on here in Lincoln County, before the period of white settlement, the land and waters we now occupy on the Oregon coast were home to the Tillamook and Alsea peoples. It is right and just to recognize these sovereign Indian nations and to remember the dispossession they were forced to endure. Despite these losses, Tillamook and Alsea people continue to thrive and collectively as part of the existing confederations. As we learn from these nations within the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz, as well as our neighbors, the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, we look forward to collaborating on common goals. Now, what we've been really all waiting for, we're very fortunate tonight to have Doug Robinson with us to speak. Doug is a professor of wildlife science and curator of birds at Oregon State University. He is the chief editor and academic of the academic journal Frontiers in Bird Science. Birds are his expertise, his vocation, and his avocation. He studies birds to understand how and why they respond to environmental change, as well as why they live the lives the way they do. Doug's committed to establishing benchmarks of biodiversity to help future generations truly understand how bird populations change through time. To that end, he is probably one of the world's top contributors to the community science database eBird that he'll be speaking about tonight. So we can't give him a big round of applause, but we're very glad to have him with us, and I'll turn it over to Doug.
Thanks, Kent. We can manipulate our sharing here. Over here, share that, and click here. How's that look? Good? All right. Well, thanks for the opportunity, folks at Seven Capes, to give a talk. You're probably thinking that if you are going to come to an eBird talk and that one of the top contributors in the world to eBird is going to talk to you. He's going to talk to you about counting birds and how much it matters to contribute your bird count data to eBird. And I will talk a little bit about that, but hopefully I'll surprise you with a couple of the ways I think it's easy to make contributions to eBird that don't necessarily involve counting and that provide perhaps underappreciated ways to help us learn about birds and to gain new knowledge that helps us promote bird conservation. So one of the things that I want to do is basically do a quick overview of what eBird is, just in case there are folks who are curious about it and who are attending just because they want to learn more. But I think most people do know. They know it's a an online archive where we can input our lists of species we see and the numbers of each species we see. And of course, the Cornell Lab team and many researchers all around the world use those contributions to learn more about birds, where the birds are found, how many there are, what seasons they're most common in which places, and all those things that we all like to know as birders and naturalists. But the eBird website has a ton of resources on how to contribute and summaries, especially on their science page, of what they do with that information. And so I won't talk a whole lot about that, except for at the very end, I will have a few suggestions about best counting practices to help us address some kinds of questions that are now feasible for us to understand about birds or to answer about birds. So instead of focusing on that, though, like I said, I'm going to concentrate on what people can do to contribute to eBird and help birds. And I'm going to focus on these other ways because I know that not everybody is great at identifying birds and not everybody's great at counting birds, yet they love birds. And so there are ways that you can make contributions that really help out birds. And so the three things I'm going to focus on today are photography, recordings, and then, like I said, a little bit on counting birds. So I'm going to basically introduce the ideas of why photography and recordings are interesting and some of the things that we're learning from contributions to eBird of photographs and recordings. And I'm going to tend to focus on ways that we're learning more about Oregon birds with respect to the contributions of pictures and recordings. So hopefully you'll find some of these things interesting and maybe new. Maybe you haven't heard of some of these advances that are happening, all because we have access to uh, dumping photos and recordings into eBird and hoping that someone uses them for something. I'll show you that they actually are using those. So first, one of the great wonders about birds is how many people are interested in them, right? If a mega rarity shows up somewhere in the populated world anyway, it can be absolutely startling how many people show up to observe it. And those people obviously are super passionate because, I mean, this picture here, it's not exactly a commune with nature sort of experience to be standing in that crowd, uh, trying to see some rare bird off in the distance. But the other thing that you will obviously be apparent is that birders are so passionate that they'll spend thousands of dollars on optics and, of course, informational books so that they can learn more about how to find birds and identify them correctly and travel. So birders get around and they have tools and they want to see birds and they also see that what they're observing has value to other people too, because so many other people care about birds. And so, what that sets up is an opportunity for people to find lots of different ways to enjoy birds and to share their knowledge. And so, that's why I'm going to focus on photography here first in the first section of the talk. So, um, any kind of photography that focuses on birds can range from being extremely expensive and extremely time consuming, the kinds of expenses of time and money that professional photographers engage in. Those are the folks who sell their pictures and try to get in National Geographic or win awards or whatever. It can go from that kind of photography all the way to simply carrying around a small camera that will help you remember your bird outing or catch some record shot of a fun observation. And it's true that more and more people are prioritizing getting pictures above other aspects of birding that you tend to engage in. So it's more accessible for more people to carry around cameras than ever before. I was in the Northeast last fall birding Connecticut and Rhode Island, and it was especially amazing and prominent there how basically every birder was carrying the same camera with the big grayish white telephoto lens slung over their shoulder. It was really clear that getting pictures and posting them and sharing them had become a primary motivator for people to get out and find birds. When I was growing up, if anybody had a camera, it was like the ultra wealthy people. And I found all kinds of rare birds as when I was a kid growing up in Illinois, and I rarely ever was able to get any kind of shot. Even an identifiable record shot was just not feasible for me. And now it seems like just about everybody has a camera. And that's great if you have one because you can make contributions to our knowledge of birds in a couple of ways. One obvious one is that you can get photos of birds that have some sort of tag on them, right? And waterfowl are a prominent example of this, as are terns, gulls, and shorebirds. And when those markers have readable numbers on them, if you can get a photo that or a series of photos that allows those tags to be seen clearly, then researchers will find those pictures when they get uploaded to your eBird checklist. And they'll be able to not only track those individual birds and how and where they're going by looking at series of pictures taken by different photographers and different eBird checklists, but they can also do some pretty sophisticated analyses of their survival rates of birds. And of course, meaning that if you see the same bird over multiple years and you know it's the same bird because the photographs are showing the same neck collar, for example, in this swan, you can figure out what the lifespan of that bird is. And there's in my field, there's some sophisticated statistical models that'll allow you to look at those repeat observations of individual birds and then estimate how long they live. And of course, for conservation purposes, knowing survival rate is one of the most important metrics that we have to measure. That feeds directly into population models that help us predict how populations of birds are doing, whether they're going up or down or remaining stable. So that's an obvious way that photos help. Another one that maybe most people hadn't thought of is that many bird photos posted online show birds eating. And there's surprisingly little information about the diet of most bird species. Much of the data that there are come from early bird collectors who collected specimens. So this is generally before 1950, often even earlier than that, where the collectors examined stomach contents to try to figure out what the common food items are for each kind of bird that they were collecting and then preparing as a specimen to put in a collection somewhere. Now, raptors pose a particular challenge for even a stomach analysis because, as you can imagine, opening up a stomach on a raptor to see what they eat just shows you little bits of flesh, and it's really hard to figure out what exactly that flesh came from. So there have been some recent papers that used the pictures associated with eBird checklists, and all those pictures, of course, when they're on an eBird checklist, are deposited in the Macaulay Library. And those studies have analyzed what martial eagles on the left and the tiny hawk on the right eat. And I won't say too much about the martial eagle, but I will about tiny hawk because it's a bird that I have a special affinity for. It is a nice find in a place where I've been doing my own bird research for a long time in Panama. It's not a common bird there, and so we always get excited when we find it. It's quite small, so much smaller than a sharp-shinned hawk. It's like between the size of a robin and a California scrub jay. So it's a pretty small hawk. And in fact, one of the reasons the analysis of uh, photos in the Macaulay Library and what the tiny hawks were eating became interesting is because in the literature it said that based on a few observations that tiny hawks were hummingbird specialists. And if you've ever been to the tropics and you have watched hummingbirds there, you will know that that is one heck of a feat if you can specialize on catching a tropical hummingbird. They make our Anna's hummingbirds and Rufus hummingbirds and the speed that our hummingbirds move at look like they're flying through molasses. I mean, tropical hummingbirds are lightning quick. So for a little accipiter to be able to specialize on catching them, that's pretty darn amazing. And of course, it turned out that when people reviewed the images in the Macaulay Library, that tiny hawks were not hummingbird specialists. They did occasionally take them, but they ate a wide variety of small birds and other vertebrates and also big insects. And so, in my mind, that's good news because I would worry about them if they depended on catching lightning fast tropical hummingbirds. It turns out they have a pretty broad diet. So obviously, we can learn a fair bit about the diet from looking at the large number of pictures online, especially for big charismatic birds like this. These are birds, one of the reasons, besides the fact that they grab attention because they're charismatic, so therefore they get photographed a lot. That means there's a fair bit of data, but they also have a long processing time, right? You catch a bird, you take it back to the perch, you pluck the feathers off, then you start eating it. That takes a while, so that gives photographers time to actually get a picture and picture that it makes the food item identifiable. So, really neat source of contribution by photographers to learning basic biology about birds. Closer to home, and speaking of glamorous, although this female is gray, the male evening grosbeaks really grab photographers' attentions quite a bit, right? Bright yellow and black, white wing patches, and pretty loud, so they draw attention. Um, they also draw attention more, I would say, in the east of the US than they do out west because they're one of our regular birds, so to speak. We always like seeing them, but they have this tendency to engage in eruptions. So they breed, the eastern forms breed in Canada, and then apparently when their food crop fails in Canada, they'll start wandering south into the eastern United States, and they'll show up at sunflower feeders, and the photographers just go wild because they're such amazing, cool looking birds. Um, when they show up at those feeders, though, they also often get photographed foraging on natural foods. So within the yards or around towns where evening grosbeaks are showing up, birders and photographers will seek out the birds and they'll snap pictures. And a lot of times they're like this, where you can not necessarily see that there's a food item in the beak of every bird, but you can draw a pretty strong conclusion that they're eating these noble fir seeds. I guess maybe the female on the right that's facing us has a little seed in her beak. But the point is that they're charismatic birds, glamorous, whatever the word is you'd like to use. They draw the attention of photographers. And if they're perched somewhere and give the photographer an opportunity to snap a bunch of pictures, they kind of inadvertently also gather information about what the diet of the bird is. So, related to the handling time, giving opportunities for photography that informs our knowledge of dietary items like the raptors did. One of the reasons that we can learn a lot about evening grosbeak diet is that they are granivores, and so they eat seeds, and those take a long time to process. So the grosbeaks will pluck the seed off or the fruit, and then they'll work on it for long enough that the photographers have a chance to actually snap pictures of the birds eating. And we can look at those pictures and learn about their diet. Um, Essentially, grosbeaks are what ornithologists call arboreal granivores, which just means that they eat tree seeds up in trees. We like to use complicated language sometimes, but they'll also eat certain fruits. But really, when they're doing that, they're removing the fruit to get to the seed inside most of the time. They really are truly seed eaters. Super powerful bills. They can, if you get them in the hand, they can bite the snot out of you. I mean, they are really powerful beaks, and it's very uncomfortable if they bite you just the wrong way. So there's a lot of leverage and a lot of power in that beak, so they can crack just about any seed that they can get a good hold on. Here's several examples of photos in eBird where we're able to see them eating crab apples and pine seeds and juniper, among other things. And if you look at enough photos, suddenly we have a realistic chance to characterize the wide diversity of foods the species eat. And we can answer questions about like how does the diet vary across the range of the bird because it's distributed pretty widely. We can try to identify like what are the most important foods that might fail that will cause those eruptive migratory movements. All kinds of interesting questions can be answered once we know something basic like what do these birds eat? So my students and I went through the Macaulay Library images. Turns out there's 75,000 pictures of evening grosbeaks already in the Macaulay Library. And we tried to identify the natural food items that were found. So on this graph, you're seeing the increase in the number of pictures of evening grosbeaks by year that are archived in the Macaulay Library. And so you see that there weren't very many until around 2011. And then I think it was about 2014 when eBird implemented, made it easier to add photos. And then 2016, 17 is when they implemented the drag and drop option, which caused the number of photos that get added to the library to just skyrocket. He just essentially, they made it easy for people to put their pictures in there, and people like it when it's easy. And so it ends up being north of 75,000 pictures that we looked at. And we wanted to know how did the foods of the grosbeaks, what were the foods of the grosbeaks, and how those foods might vary across the range of the birds. And so here's a map of where all the photos came from. Each of the circles is a location where we were able to look at um, a picture that had an identifiable food item in the beak of an evening grosbeak, and the size of the circle increases as the number of observations at that location goes up. But you can see that they're coming from a pretty wide area. Lots in the Northeast, lots in the West, then scattered numbers across Canada and the Midwest where they don't breed, but they do spend parts of some winters. So pretty good distribution. So altogether, we found out of those 75,000 pictures, we found 1,000 where we could identify the natural food item that the grosbeak was eating. And we probably found 10 to 15 times that number where the birds were photographed at sunflower feeders. So that's what they do when they leave their breeding grounds um, and start wandering south for the winter or wandering around the continent is they end up at sunflower feeders, and they're obviously easy to photograph when they're at feeders. So there are lots and lots of pictures of evening grosbeaks at sunflower feeders in the Macaulay Library. But we can learn a lot from those kinds of things. So what did we learn? Well, we learned that grosbeaks are super generalists on tree seeds. They ate 96 species from 25 different plant families, primarily maples, elms, crab apples, junipers and box elders, those kinds of things. Like on the right, you see pictures of the samaras, the winged seeds from box elders and maples. They really like those. Um, but it turns out that despite that large number of pictures, 1,000 natural food items, 1,000 pictures with natural food items, that's still not enough to fully characterize the diet. That's how diverse the diet is. So we have some stats that we can run on like data that tally up how many times each species was represented in a picture of an evening grosbeak eating some food that allow us to estimate what the actual number might be if we had a bigger sample size. And it's predicted to be 197 different species. Only 35 in the Pacific Northwest. It's bigger for all of the evening grosbeak range. I point out the Pacific Northwest because despite the fact that we love our evening grosbeaks and we have lots of pictures in the Macaulay Library, the Pacific Northwest region was the most incompletely sampled. So we saw evidence of 35 different species of food plants, but there were 197 out there predicted to be. So these birds are eating a really, really diverse diet. So why do we care? Why do we care about uh, bird diet, and why do we want to encourage people to photograph foraging birds? Well, for a species like evening grosbeaks, we want to learn more about why they engage in these eruptive movements after the breeding season, and why are they common in some places one year, then absent in other years. They're really erratic in their occurrence outside their breeding areas. And one idea is that they leave places where their foods are failing in that particular late summer or fall, and maybe there are no seeds of their favorite plants being available. But is that the right idea? If they consume 100 or 200 different kinds of tree seeds, I mean, can everything be failing massively all at the same time and drive movements like that? It's a really interesting question that needs more data to be evaluated properly. And the first step is figuring out what they eat, and then subsequent steps will be like learning more about the plants and their seed production cycles. Also, evening grosbeaks are famous for having experienced very large declines in numbers since the 1970s. So, are those declines because some of their food resources have declined? We can't even begin to know until we know what they eat, where they eat it, and how much those foods matter to their populations. Just as an example, you see on this slide, evening grosbeaks up in elm trees eating seeds there during, and this is during their spring migration stopover on the Corvallis campus. Back in the 70s, they used to swarm to campus in the spring by the hundreds of thousands, like literally. Fred Ramsey was a statistician at OSU, and he estimated that the peak numbers in the early to mid 70s were 150 to 250,000 evening grosbeaks on campus. There were so many on campus on a sunny spring day, students would walk between classes carrying their umbrellas, not because there was any rain, it was sunny and clear, but because there were so many grosbeaks that they had to keep the bird crap off of them. That's how abundant they were. So now their numbers are down in the hundreds or the low thousands every spring. The bird nerds help do surveys on campus, and our maximum count over the last 6 or 8 years was 10,000, and that was our best year. Usually the numbers are in the low thousands. Um, but the fact that they come into campus and eat these elm seeds is really interesting, and might help us unravel clues as to why their numbers have slid. Anyway, there's a bunch of people working on evening grosbeaks now, and so all the interest in them has prompted uh, people like my students to go through the Macaulay Library images and see what we can learn about their diet, and then figure out what the next steps will be. Okay, it's also Macaulay Library, and your eBird checklists are a massive source of audio recordings. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how you can also make contributions to promote knowledge about birds and help conserve them by adding your audio recordings to your eBird checklists. So more than 3 million and counting recordings in the library now. That's an absolutely stunning number of bird sound recordings, right? I mean, that's just kind of unbelievable. The digitization, whatever the right word is, of sound recordings really has made that quite possible. Um, I'll talk a little bit about what we're learning about some examples of science being done on audio recordings, but it's also an incredible learning resource. I use it for the students in my bird classes all the time, where I direct them over there, and you can listen to the sounds, and you can also watch them, right? You can see how the sound is actually visualized in 2 dimensions. And so you've seen these before, I hope, if you've poked around on eBird, but every sound file automatically generates what's called a spectrogram, which is a visualization of how the frequency of the sound, or the pitch, changes as time goes by. So time is down on the horizontal axis and goes from the beginning on the left to however long it takes for the sound to play out on the right. And then the pitch goes from low on the bottom left to high on the top left axis. And so these lines trace how the frequency is changing as time goes by. So, for example, on the left, those are sounds that are ascending whistles. They're pure, so pure sounds are narrow lines, and this is going up as time goes by. So it sounds something like, so maybe you could phoneticize that as sweet, sweet, sweet. So it starts low, goes up, sweeps pretty pure note, and then on the right it starts high and it goes down, also a pure note. So in that case, maybe it sounds like cheer, cheer, cheer. So it's going down. And these are both Northern Cardinal songs, by the way. Cardinals can switch it back and forth from ascending to descending. But the point here is that as researchers interested in birds, we can look at these millions of recordings and we have ways that we can measure the characteristics of each of those notes and answer interesting questions about what's going on with geographic variation in the sounds or just characterizing the vocabulary of birds, which is absolutely incredible. If you become really expert at identifying bird sounds, you'll realize that there's one prominent noise that we always associate with a particular bird, but every species has dozens of sounds that they make. And so it's a lifelong process to be really super good at identifying birds by sound. So let's go back to our evening grosbeaks as an example here. They're distributed across northern and western North America during their breeding seasons, like I mentioned earlier. And until recently, that distribution was broken up into different sections or populations that we refer to as call types. And these call types, well, each call type has a slightly different variation of the call that grosbeaks give while they're flying. And that's called, we call them their flight call. And so the flight calls are different depending on what call type population that bird is a member of. So on the map in the green off to the right is the eastern type, which we call type 3. And the peach color on the upper left is ours. It's the type 1. The purple in the southern Rockies is the type 4. And the little bit of blue in the California Sierra Nevadas right over there next to the chest of the bird is type 2. And then that little bit down in western Mexico, northwestern Mexico, is type 5. Um, but because of all the recordings that have been loaded into eBird, oh, and I should say the little black squiggly lines are the spectrograms for each of those call types. So you can see how they vary pretty distinctively. To us who've measured hundreds and hundreds of these things, they are really obviously different. Sometimes the squiggly lines that represent their flight calls don't do justice to how different they sound by ear either, because they sound very different from each other. So it's pretty obvious why ornithologists started to say, "Wait a minute, what's going on?" I've run into evening grosbeaks in Quebec, and they don't sound anything like the evening grosbeaks in Oregon. We need to study this more. Um, but so anyway, within the type 3 birds, about right where the spectrogram is pointing at the sort of central Canada part of that type 3 range. By analyzing all the sounds in eBird, we actually discovered that that Alberta Saskatchewan area has a different type, a type 6 we call it, that no one had recognized before. And so it was because of birder contributions and loading recordings into eBird in the Macaulay Library that we discovered this type that no one had recognized before. And so um, the whole process of adding pictures into eBird has really boomed in popularity. This is a similar graph style to one I showed you earlier, where you got the year down there on the horizontal axis and the number of recordings that have been added. And the first description of the formal description of some of the call types was by that Sewell 2004 paper. And you can see that as the lines go along to the right through time, that there was a little bit of increase in interest, but it was still hard to get your audio recordings into eBird. And then around 2016, they created the drag and drop implementation for audio files. And that's where people were like, okay, now not only can I easily add audio recordings to my eBird checklists, but I can do it right from my phone, and I'll show you how to do that here in a second. But you can see that the number of recordings of evening grosbeaks just continues to climb, and the type one line is the highest out of the four types where the recordings have sort of accumulated at a reasonable rate. Type one is ours. So a lot of the research that's been done in the Northwest on the grosbeaks is contributing a lot of data to eBird. So lots and lots of pictures of flight calls of evening grosbeaks to measure and learn something about. And so you might look at a graph like this and say, wow, that's impressive, but okay, so next, why do we need to keep doing this? Well, one of the other cool things we learned is that if you look at just the type three birds in the same or very similar places through the years, that the structure of the call actually changes. So birds recorded 70 years ago in Ontario, and that upper left image, June 1955, look a lot different from birds recorded 2018 to 2021. So not only are we able to figure out which types are occurring in which places at which times of year by looking at the recordings, but when we get these long series of recordings through time, we can actually see the structure of the calls evolving or changing. And nobody knows why this happens. We were the first ones to document that it does, and we haven't seen it in other call types. So there's something about the type threes that is interesting and different, that's causing the structure of their calls to differ. So lots of interesting things to follow up on and do some additional research on. And again, it's all happening and coming to our attention because so many birders enjoy recording birds and uploading recordings in their checklists. There's no way a research team at a university could do this kind of thing without help from birders contributing sounds. I'll give you one more interesting recent example of looking at the recordings on eBird that we've been learning from, and that's looking at hidden diversity in purple finches. Some people might know that there's two basically subspecies that have been recognized. There's the eastern purple finch, which on the map here, the pale gray in the north is eastern purple finch. And you can see it's kind of a weird name for that subspecies because, yeah, they are found in the east, but they're also found all the way to Alaska. So basically, they really ought to be called the northern purple finch. And then the dark gray is the range of the western purple finch. So they're along the west coast, essentially from Vancouver down to Southern California. And why it's interesting, these colored circles represent genetic information. And a recent genetic study showed that the birds on the west with the purple circles have a very different set of genes than the northern or eastern purple finches with the orange and green. Those just represent proportions of different gene complexes present in their analyses. You see that they're really quite different. So they're genetically different enough that they probably ought to be called separate species. They're really dramatically different. So what does that have to do with sound recordings? Well, we went through the Macaulay Library to see if the eastern and the western birds have different calls, and they do. In fact, you can correctly identify them based on just a few characters, essentially 100% of the time. So the spectrogram on the left is our western. It starts lower frequency. It spans a much bigger range of frequencies. It's the same duration, very brief flight call as the eastern, but the frequency range and where they start is extremely different. So our westerns, when they're flying over, it sounds like this brief little low pitched pit or spit or something like that. Whereas the easterns span a much narrower range of frequencies, start higher, end higher, and so it has more of a peak, peak, or teep call. It's obviously different when you hear them go by. So that's something that's very cool that folks had never keyed in on or published about yet. So we're going to submit a paper describing that statistically here in the next week or so. It's pretty exciting to discover that kind of diversity. And The other exciting thing is we found those stark differences from just a few samples. There's lots of recordings of purple finches in the Macaulay Library, but they're almost all songs. There's not very many flight calls. And so these red squares are where the samples came from that were eastern birds, and the blue diamonds are the ones that came from western birds. And you can see a couple interesting things here. For one, there's a big old gap in Canada where there's no flight call recordings that we could find. And over there in California, there's some eastern birds. And if you know you're birding on the West Coast, you know California is just they're just lucky. They get all the vagrants. So they even get vagrant eastern purple finches. But the point is here that even with a few recordings, you can learn a lot of interesting things. So it's really helpful if birders take the time to get recordings, even if it's a bird flying over and you're like, nobody will ever use this. Why am I doing this? That's not true. Somebody probably will use it because it's useful data and it tells us interesting things about birds. So if you wanted to do this, uh, how do you do it? Lots of people know how to get a camera and to get pictures and upload those, but not a lot of people are aware of like how would you actually go about adding recordings? And it's remarkably simple if you've got a smartphone. Um, I'll just put a plug in for the app that I use, which is called Voice Record Pro. It's super easy. If a bird comes by, I just immediately open the app and I hit record, and it does an amazing job retrieving the sound and storing it as a file. It gives you options on how to save those, many different options. So if you like to put your stuff on Google Drive or OneDrive or Dropbox or whatever, it'll walk you through the process and how to send your files there. You can wait and send them and when you're on Wi-Fi, and so you don't use up your cell plan data allotment any faster than you really want to. I do recommend that you take the option to record the files in .wav format because that's what eBird likes the best. Um, Otherwise, one of the things that is also important once you figure out how to use the app, and like I said, it'll take you 30 seconds to figure out how to use this app, um, is if you are walking around or something and carrying your phone and it's recording all kinds of extraneous noise, it's really nice to trim some of that out before you finalize the upload onto your eBird checklist. And so there's a program called Raven Light that the Cornell Lab makes, and it's very easy to use. You just wherever you park your files on your computer, you just point Raven Light to the file you want, you open it up, and you literally just select the part that's got the bird sounds in it and save them as a different file. And then you can load that directly into your eBird checklist. If you don't like that program, there's another one that's free called Audacity. It does very similar things. But just select out the best part and load it up. And it's pretty easy. It gets to be addicting too. eBird now will like count up for you the number of species you've got recordings for that you put into eBird and the Macaulay Library by, all the things they do to divide up the number of species you've seen, year, county, state, life, all that. It'll do that for your audio recordings too. So it can motivate you to like focus on doing that. If you really, really, really want to get into it, then the other thing you can do is you can aim for higher quality recordings. And in that case, you can track down a parabolic microphone system or a shotgun, which is, just a long microphone that's very directional. And the company that I've found that provides really good service and good quality items is the Stith Recording Company in Ithaca. There's lots of resources, other sources out there for this kind of stuff, but I've had good luck working with them. Okay, so that's photography and that's recordings. So just a quick word about putting your bird counting effort to work. One of the things that we can do now is we can estimate bird population sizes from count data. And the way we do that is we associate counts with the habitat information around the location where you counted the birds. And so when we aggregate that information across bigger areas, that means we can estimate how many birds of each species there are for a county, a refuge, a state, a country, whatever. We can even do it for land ownership, like what's the fraction of an endangered species population size that's on private land versus public land? Or, there's a million different ways to look at land and try to figure out what fraction of a bird's populations are in which places. And that really helps the conservation prioritization planning process, helps make sure that the people who have most of the birds on their property are the ones who are spending most of their money on those instead of, some agency or organization thinking they have most of the birds, but they don't, and sort of not optimizing the way they spend their conservation resources. So using eBird data can help with getting those numbers, but there's a major catch. Uh, the fundamental question is how many birds are there? But to get at that fundamental question, you got to have a few things right. First, you got to make sure that people are identifying the species right. And that's something that's very hard to know for sure just from looking at checklists of data. So some assumptions have to be made about that. The eBird team has ways of figuring out when the probability might be wrong that are pretty sophisticated. The numbers have to be accurate, also quite challenging to figure out when that's true. One thing that you can control very easily, or most easily, is that the location has to be accurate. So I like to tell people it's like, okay, what's the best way to get the data to help researchers to do this kind of work? And it turns out that most birders who use eBird do traveling counts. And so you start a checklist, and this is what the eBird app actually kind of subtly encourages you to do because that you have to turn off the tracking in order to do a stationary count. So most people do traveling counts. About 75% or so of the data in eBird is a traveling count. The tricky bit is that, or the catch, as I said earlier, is that the traveling counts are nearly useless for predicting abundance in particular habitats. And you would say, well, why? I don't get understand why. Well, for one thing, if you're traveling a really long way, say you are at a refuge and you go 5 miles and do one traveling count, you're going to go through 6, 8, 10 different habitats, and you're going to see a bunch of different birds. And we're not going to be able to figure out what habitat those birds were in because you've aggregated all of the bird sightings into one pin drop somewhere along your route, probably at the very beginning. And that's the location. And so the habitat that you started the checklist at may be very different from the habitat that you've traveled through while you're counting birds. And so essentially, those checklists can be good for other things, but they're not very helpful for estimating bird population sizes. We just don't know what habitats you've sampled. So this is true even if you map the track. So you say you open up the eBird app, you start the track, and it's keeping track of where you are and what time. It roughly will be able to figure out where certain birds were at based on the time that you tap the species or the number. But we all know that not everybody taps birds as they encounter them. And so it's still a very, very loose relationship. We still don't know where you saw each bird that you found when you were on that traveling route. So what habitats were they in? Don't know. It's very hard to be confident in that. And if you're going to make relationships that connect birds with the right places, you want to have a higher level of confidence in where people were and where the birds were at. Okay, here's the disappointing part that I'm going to break the news to people about. Um, Traveling checklists don't help a lot because of the location errors, essentially, that get implemented into your data. The hotspots are basically the same. Everybody seems to love the hotspots. If you use an established hotspot, you're almost never standing at the exact same place where the pin was dropped on the hotspot. So you're moving the location of the birds that you saw when you were birding, even if you did a stationary count, to the location is moved from where you actually were to the location where the hotspot pin is. And so that same problem of associating the birds and their abundance with the habitat is diluted in the same way it is for a, traveling checklist. And so the better solution to help more kinds of surveys and help get us to estimating population sizes is to create a new personal location, add a stationary count so that you can ensure that the bird and the habitat information are getting properly linked together. That's the only way to reliably generate precise maps. Okay, so here's a obvious example. I grew up in Southern Illinois, and one of the lakes there is called Crab Orchard Lake. Everybody who goes to look at the birds stands on the spillway, the blue balloon there, but the hot spot is the red balloon out in the middle of the lake. And so everybody standing on the spillway also hears titmice and cardinals and Carolina wrens and red-bellied woodpeckers. But if you do your typical habitat analysis and you draw the circle around the hotspot pin, it's solid water. So you're never going to have titmice and Carolina wrens and all those land birds there. So that relationship breaks down and you can't use it for the analyses. So my quick recommendation is if you want your counts to count and to really help bird conservation by letting us figure out what habitats the birds like and what their population sizes are, try to conduct some stationary counts. Not saying never do a traveling count, but try to add some stationary counts into your process. Try going somewhere new. That's always fun and exciting. Use personal locations because that'll your phone will drop the pin right where you are, so you get the exact location and pay attention to it to make sure that it's putting it in a place where you know you are. Um, Counting errors, I often recommend people to keep those stationary counts pretty short because when they're in the 3 to 10 minute range, we tend to be a lot more accurate in our counts of the birds, and so it really helps that way. Um, and pay attention to getting the counts right on the common birds too, because those are the ones that it turns out we get more data on, and so we can make more precise estimates of what their population sizes are. And that means don't guess. This is the professor coming out. Actually count. Don't just guess at the numbers. Do your best to be accurate. If you do get a big number, which you'll almost never trip a eBird filter when you're doing short stationary counts. But if you do get a big number, just say something in the comments like exact count or something like that, so that the researchers looking at the data know you are trying your best and you're paying attention. Okay, so last thing I want to say is uh, some encouragement. Basically, focus on what you love about birds. There's a lot of different ways to contribute information to online data repositories like eBird and the Macaulay Library. And I would say that the best thing to do is figure out what you are good at or what you want to be good at, um, practice it, and realize that every contribution that you're making above and beyond counting birds and finding species, the photos really help, the recordings really help. It feels like when you're just one person doing it, that you might not be doing anything that people will ever use, but I am confident that that's not true. When we all work together and we all do these different things, it all adds up, and we are doing an amazing job in this era of the digital world, where we're able to basically share the effort and make some amazing progress really fast. Discover new things like hidden diversity in birds and call types that we hadn't recognized before, and all kinds of things like that. And I'll end up by talking about briefly. I like this pyramid image to illustrate how different observations in eBird can get used. If you just note a location of a bird that you've observed, particular species, you just identify it and you put a dot on a map. This is the place I saw that. Researchers can use that information. Your checklists don't have to be big, long, sophisticated surveys. A dot on a map provides information that can get used. So that's like the foundational contribution of a bird observation to eBird. Next level up is if you can keep a complete list of the species that you found at a particular place, but you don't count them, you just make a species list. There are lots of interesting questions that people can answer about birds from those data as well. Then the next level up And the next sort of level of sophistication is if you have your complete list of species you identified and count data, then hey, we're getting into some really more detailed questions that can be answered there. And then finally, with regard to count information anyway, if you find your favorite patch somewhere in your neighborhood and you just want to this is what I like to do. I feel like I'm making a meaningful contribution. If I go count birds at this place on some particular schedule and I just keep putting data in there, that's the top of the pyramid. That's where you can start to look at trends through time and numbers and population sizes. Those sorts of trends help us predict risks that bird populations are confronting or benefits of restoration as we see numbers go up. That trend information is really helpful. So there are lots and lots of ways to contribute data to eBird and make a useful contribution to helping birds, to learning more about birds, to conserving birds, and to build your network of friends who are doing similar things. So I think that's it. Enjoy the birds. Thanks for listening to the ideas, and I hope we have a fun question and answer session.
Well, thank you very much, Doug. And if people would please put their questions, you've got a Q&A tab at the bottom. I see there's one question there, and Nissa will read those off. But let's get some questions posted in there and start a conversation.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that was a lot of awesome information.
Good.
So questions so far from an anonymous. Are the data, especially recordings of birds using bird feather PUC recording units, being used by the Macaulay Library or are other entities for analysis by ornithologists?
That's a good question. Or if you're referring to the autonomous sound recording units, the lab has designed their own version, the Swift recorders, and there's a variety of different other ones you can buy on the market. And they are now taking longer files into the Macaulay Library. They'll archive long ones. For a while, they had a pretty low limit on the length that those sound files could be, but they are archiving those. And there's lots and lots of ornithologists using um, autonomous recording units to make recordings of birds and other wildlife and answering interesting questions about birds. And those questions are all over the map from, how many species are vocalizing in this community, to how are they responding to different habitat treatments, to surveying for different kinds of flight calls of finches. We've used them in our evening grosbeak work. So yeah, there's a lot going on with those sound recorders. It's data overload in a lot of ways because it's tempting to let them run for hours every day. It takes a lot of time and effort to go through those sound recordings and figure out what you're going to get. The technology to screen them quickly for you is improving, but it's still got a long ways to go. So there's a lot of software that you can run the files through, and it can flag certain things for you that you tell it to look for, but you always have to go back and double check it to make sure it's right because there's a lot of error. Someday that hopefully will be improved, but it's quite the resource.
So we got a few more questions rolling in as you're answering that one. So Michael Babbitt would like to know, please elaborate on how to best count or estimate numbers of birds in flocks.
That's a really good question. So if I'll put it in a plug for the Willamette Valley Bird Symposium here because I'm the faculty advisor for that, and that's January the 31st, Saturday on campus at the Alumni Center here in Corvallis. And my grad student Nolan Clements and I had a bird counting game built to help students learn how to do exactly that. And he is going to summarize what we've learned about how that game works and how we teach students to get better at counting birds. In a nutshell, the basic idea is to practice first on small flocks. And it's great if you can take a picture of the flock because then you can estimate the number of birds and then check to see how accurate you are by looking at your picture. But what I normally do is if I see, let's say there's hundreds of birds out there, some big flock, the first thing I do is find an edge of it and I look for like 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and then do that again, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. I get a visual idea of what 10 looks like. And then I'll count 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 groups of 10 and just multiply those that way. For really, really big flocks of birds, you need to probably figure out what 50 looks like and then do 50 over and over again. But it takes a lot of practice because birds are swirling around usually, or if they're not, if they're on the ground, they're stepping in front of each other. And so you're going to make mistakes. It's going to take a lot of practice to get good. But the best thing to do is to try to slow your mind down and focus on what does a small number look like, and then how many groups of that small number are there in the flock. That's what works the best for me.
Great advice. I can't wait to hear what the results of grad
Yeah,
students work.
they're pretty interesting. It takes some people a very, very, very long number of trials to get better, and other people master it really fast. So it's pretty interesting.
Great. Vicky would like to know what is the best way to learn how to use all the details in eBird? So I guess resources for learning more about how to use it.
Yeah, I would say if you haven't looked at it already, usually it's on the front page, I think. There's a video that they've got called eBird Essentials. That's the best way to get started. It won't tell you everything, but it will tell you the basics of what they hope you will do. By the way, some of it disagrees with what I told you in the seminar because they have other kinds of analyses they do where they only use the traveling counts. But I think given that there's a billion observations in eBird now, and there's lots of traveling counts, I feel like the next step and a better outcome for bird conservation needs is to get to the estimating the population size stuff. And the most reliable count data that will let us get there are the stationary counts where you can zero in on the habitat that was surveyed. But that eBird Essentials course, I think it's maybe 2 to 3 hours long altogether, so it's pretty detailed. So I would recommend looking at that. If you've already done that and you want to learn even more, two recommendations. One is just go poking around. You're not going to like break anything or mess anything up if you just click on every link you see on the eBird pages and go explore and sort of see what everything does. It feels like everything on there is hyperlinked to something. So it's pretty deep. You can explore a lot. The other is they have a fantastic, fairly newly revised help menu. And so if you're like, I would like to know if I can do this thing with eBird or learn that from eBird, just type it into their help search and it's really good. Jenna Curtis basically revised all that. She was a PhD student at OSU and went to work for eBird 2019, I think. So
Okay. Great point about the stationary versus traveling counts too. Can definitely see where that would be more
yeah,
useful.
yeah.
Our last question that we have right now, and folks, please feel free to enter more questions in. We have plenty of time. Um, awesome. But our next question is, can you please talk a bit about vagrant birds and in the current emergent understanding about what they tell us about the impact of climate change on bird dispersal?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So it's really hard to figure out if like our everyday um, what's the word envisioning of what climate change is has much of an influence on birds and their patterns of vagrancy. Um, in some ways, having looked at like long time series of information about climatic variables on the planet, I would be surprised if that drives vagrancy patterns because the planet goes through these very long cycles of all kinds of different climatic phenomena, temperatures, rainfall, wind direction. magnetic phenomena, all kinds of things. Magnetic phenomena is not necessarily a climatic variable, but that does fluctuate and it does influence where birds go. There was a recent paper that came out that showed higher vagrancy patterns when the solar radiation activity was affecting the Earth's magnetic field more. And so birds are responding to things like that. So there's another cycle that gets added that may influence vagrancy patterns. And that's the cycle that the sun goes through and how it throws off solar flares and what magnitude they are and what time of the year they show up. Um, I would say that the real driver of vagrant birds actually is weather, not climate, because we tend to get more vagrant birds when the population size of a particular species is higher, and their population gets higher when the weather conditions are suitable for them to have a good year producing babies. So, if, for example, if we're looking for Nelson sparrow to show up or be observed for the first time in Oregon, then we want to know a little bit about like how was the reproduction in central Canada, where they're the most common breeder, and how was the weather? How did it affect the number of kids they produced? Because I would predict that we'd be more likely to get a vagrant in the years where they had fantastic weather conditions, the habitat was fantastic, and so there's just a higher statistical probability that one of them would wander off in a different direction and show up where we are. Um, so anyway, there's a nice book on this, on vagrancy in birds, that I'd recommend looking at. There's a lot of information in there about that. It's on my bookshelf somewhere, but A.C. Lees is one of the authors, Lees. It's a really nice book. So I'd recommend taking a look at that if you can get a hold of a copy.
Awesome. Um, Great. More questions rolling in. This is a longer one, but I think it's really interesting, so I'm going to read the whole thing out loud.
Okay.
Perhaps a niche question, but I staff a wildlife rehabilitation center. I'm interested in reporting our entire database of avian patient data, around 5,000 records, to eBird from an organizational account. Each record has the necessary data of an exact specific location found, address or intersection, and date found, but not time. I've gotten a slow start on this process using single personal locations at the exact locations on the date the bird was discovered. There have been a lot of interesting finds in our patient data and some unusual vagrants, but I'm curious of what your thoughts are on the usability of data of thousands of single exact location incidental checklist records of individual birds and its value in the grand scheme of eBird before I fully undertake such an endeavor. That does
Yeah,
sound like
it's smart of you to wonder about the value of that, Jesse, before you get into it, because I've done some of those big giant data entry and uploads, and it is a lot of work, and it seems easier when you know that it's going to be used. So in my mind, that would fall into the dots on the map stage that sort of supports the whole entire pyramid, right? The more data points you have on locations of a particular species at a particular place, the better the collective analysis of the data on that species can be. And so the better the species distribution map is. And then from other checklists, you can layer on information about the habitat abundance relationships. And not to get too much into the weeds, but you can apply the information you learn from the abundance data to the locations where you only had the incidental observations as well. That's been worked out just within the last couple of years with some collaborators that I work with. It's pretty sophisticated, but it works really well. And so the data will be used. So I would frame it in the sense of um, all observations have some value, but there is the idea out there that some of the observations are going to be more valuable than others. So is it worth your time to key in every single California scrub jay that you get brought into the rehab center, or every single American crow, or every single uh, gosling, Canada goose chick that got some attention? Um, I will never say no, and I know enough of the people at the eBird team that they would never say no. They have their arms open, right? This is the great thing and the worst thing about eBird is that they let all the data come in. And so that means that everybody's invited to participate, but it also means there's a lot of noise and mess in the data. And so I've written about the fact that if you let all the data in, then you've got all the data. And then it becomes the analyst's job to figure out which subset of that billion data points do I want to use and do I trust to answer the questions that I'm interested in. And so it really comes down to you deciding, do you want to invest your time? Because somebody will use the data for some things, but I can see how you might want to say, I'm going to triage this and I'm not going to put in all the common birds. I'm just going to put in like the 10% that are the what I consider to be the interesting records. The last thing I'll say is you're exactly right that doing it as an incidental checklist when you've got the right location, that's exactly the way to do it. And if you've got pictures, that's even better, especially for the weird stuff. That always helps. Hope
Awesome.
that helped. That's a good question.
An anonymous question, is there a way to find out if a professor, student, or group is looking for a certain kind of information on specific birds?
That's a really good question because that would be a nice motivation to help, right? Um, One way that you can figure some of this out is on INAT. For example, Caleb Santani, a lot of you may know, he was from near Dallas, grew up near Dallas, and he came to OSU and he worked on Red Cross bills and flight call types. Now he's a student at Cornell and he's going to do his PhD on the grosbeaks and various aspects of them. He's got a couple of projects on INAT where he's looking for people to help and make contributions over there and or in eBird. So you can kind of troll around INAT and see what people are doing. Um, I feel like you could potentially write to like regional groups, like the OSU group, if you're doing most of your birding in Oregon and say, hey, what are you guys working on? Or there's some things I can help with when I'm out in the field doing my own thing. We're happy to tell people about that. But I don't know off the top of my head, other than through just stumbling across things in social media, that there's like a central way to figure that out. I wish I did. That's a good idea. There should be a way to do that, but probably iNat or seeing what people talk about on Instagram or whatever is the way to go at
And for
this.
anyone not familiar, iNaturalist is an awesome platform that you should definitely dig around on if you haven't already.
Yeah, yeah.
Melissa McDowell, when you said California is lucky for vagrants, could it be because there are more birders reporting vagrants in more populated birding locations? In other words, San Diego has more birders than a place in Kansas or someplace.
Yeah, that's a good question and good observation, and it's definitely partly true, but not entirely true. There's in that vagrancy book I was mentioning earlier, AC Lees is one of the authors. They talk about these great circle routes that like Asian birds fly, where essentially genetically birds are programmed by their genes to two different things, to fly a certain direction and to fly a certain distance. And different genes control that, as far as we know, at least in the birds that have been and studied that way. Sometimes the Asian birds, or there'll be a mutation and they'll flip hey, I'm supposed to go southeast to southwest, so they'll maintain the heading, but just on the exact mirror image of it. And so they'll come across, and it always points to California, not Oregon or Washington. And so that mechanism that's driving the birds is actually sending them to California, not to us. Weather can blow them off that course, obviously, or they can land on a ship and come to Portland instead of San Francisco or whatever. But they do have more birders, and they are lucky.
Also a long state compared to us.
Yeah, it is. It's much bigger than we are.
Well, we have one more question, and folks, we still have time for more questions, so pop them in the Q&A if you have any. Um, Michael Crawl asks, "What about using sound recordings from Merlin? If one is already using it, it seems much easier than also managing another app, such as
Yeah,
another app based
yeah.
on."
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. You use whatever works the best for you because some people are good about saving recordings that they make while they have Merlin recording. Other people that I've run into just never remember to do it. But if you do that and that worked great for you, go for it. I mean, as long as it's saving a WAV file, that's the best version, and I think Merlin does. I haven't looked at Merlin in a little while. Um, it still makes too many mistakes for me to be happy with it. But I know that it does archive the recordings if you ask it to. And so by all means, whatever you find works the best for you, figure out your own workflow and use it. That's totally great. Because you're right. I mean, even just switching between the eBird app and Merlin or the eBird app and uh, uh, Voice Record Pro or something like that, it gets to be a pain, and especially if you're getting pinged by Discord alerts or email or whatever at the same time, and suddenly you're not birding, you're phoning, you know. And so that's no good. You're missing a lot of stuff if your face is in your phone, not looking for birds.
Pros and cons to our technologies.
Yeah, exactly.
Another question from Michael Babbitt. How concerned should we be about counting the same bird more than once?
Um, I'm going to be really pragmatic on this. Unless it's obviously like something very unusual and there's one there, it's a rare thing, and you know for a fact there's not two. It is very, very hard to get an accurate count on birds. And so if you occasionally double count something, don't worry about it because the reality is that most of the time in most situations, you are missing way more birds than are actually present there. Especially if you're in any cluttered environment like a forest or shrubs or something like that. You're walking by so many birds and you have no idea they're there and you miss them. And so your counts are always lower than what reality is. So if occasionally you double count some bird, it doubles back on you or flies ahead of you and you think it's a different bird, don't worry about it. It's nothing you can control. So try to do your best due diligence not to, but if you do, no big deal. Happens all the time.
That is our last question currently in the Q&A. Um, again, we still have about 11 minutes or 10 minutes now officially before we got to cut it off or before we have to cut off the webinar in general. So if we want to have take a couple more, we have time for that. Um, we can give folks a couple minutes if you want to think about it. Um, or we can, Doug, if you have any closing thoughts. Um,
I'll put in another plug for the Bird Symposium because I know that Seven Capes has been very supportive in the past. And it's a lot of fun. If you haven't been, come to Corvallis Saturday, January the 31st. We usually have between 250 and 300 people, and we start at 8:30 in the morning and go till about 4 o'clock. We've got a drawing to raise funds, so $3 a raffle ticket, I think. We've got talks by OSU researchers and community members. We've got lots of students. It's almost all students giving the talks. The keynote's usually not a student. We have an artist talking about her watercolor bird art. We always, in the last 3 years, I think, we've always had a slot for artists to talk about what they do. And then we tell our students who want to share with the public what they're learning to tell the story, not the statistics, right? That part of their training is that they have to figure out how scientists do things and learn stats and all that. But we're like, almost nobody in the audience wants to know your stats. They want to know what you're learning that's cool. And so we focus on getting the story across. And it's pretty fast moving. We got 6-minute talks, 12-minute talks. Um, I was telling Nissa and Kent that we got sort of a fun surprise we're trying to implement to kind of break up the presentations through the day that should be entertaining. It's either going to work spectacularly or flop spectacularly, but it's only going to last about 20 minutes. So uh, nothing lost if it doesn't go over well. But anyway, we're trying to be innovative and creative and keep it fun. And I think the best part is it gives you an excuse to come see your bird friends in Corvallis. People come from all over the place. They come from Washington and California even to this thing. And it's the time of year where birding is kind of slowed down and spring migration hasn't started yet, and we're all getting a little bored and grumpy because it's gray and wet outside, and no new birds are showing up. And so it's super exciting and invigorating to come and chat with your friends. And yeah, it's fun. I encourage you to come. The You can register for it and see more information on willamettvalleybirds.org. That's where the information for that is.
Awesome. I can link that in my follow-up email that I always send to webinar attendees. So I'll make sure to include that in my email, and I can definitely second that. Last year was my first time going, and it was super fun. I learned a lot, and it was really inspiring. So
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that because it's pretty nice to hear what everybody's doing. I mean, not a lot of people know that we have more PhD level ornithologists at OSU than Cornell does. And we have like dozens of graduate students. The Bird Nerds Club, which is mostly undergrads, not entirely, but mostly undergrads, has 60 to 100 members. So there's lots of undergrads on campus. Willamette University in Salem, they have a Bird Nerds group. And so they're coming down and participating in the bird symposium. So I mean, Oregon is the place to be for birds now. I always tell students who are like, "Oh, I love ornithology and I always wanted to go to Cornell." I'm like, "That's great. If you can get in there, go for it. And if your parents are willing to pay 10 prices, go for it." OSU has more birds, more bird people, and is more affordable. So come on over to the west side and we'll help you get a bird career going.
well, we haven't had any more questions come in that times, and we're right on track as far as schedule. So Kent, I'll hand it back over to you, and we can have our little conclusion here.
Great.
Well, thank you so much, Doug, for just a fascinating presentation. You definitely told the story behind eBird as well as the stats. And
Great.
special thanks to the audience for your engaging questions. The discussion is always my favorite part of it. It brings up lots of new ideas. Join us in future events. We have monthly birding outings, and you could also get engaged. There's a lot of community science opportunities besides eBird. Check us out at sevencapes.org, and we will be posting future webinar sessions there as well as our other events. And I will echo Willamette Bird Symposium is a truly fun event, both for the people and the ideas and the knowledge, and it's a lot of fun, so don't miss that. But thank you so much, Doug. It was really great.
You're welcome. Thanks for the chance and thanks for the invitation.
Good night to all, and thank you.
Bye bye.